All right, hello everyone. We're going to start with doing some squaring and square root review. So that's going to look like something like this, right? Those are our perfect squares. We're going to be on the lookout for those throughout the chapter. And let's recall some simplest radical form things. If you do have a perfect square, we can just divide, we can just take the square root right away. We know that 12 squared is 144. So that is the square root of 144 is 12. Now, we have two ways of doing simplest radical form. One way was to make a tree, list out the numbers, separate any squares with any leftovers, and we can take those out. Because after all, this is equal to the square root of 2 squared times the square root of 10. Or, the way I like to do it is to search for perfect squares. So I know that my first few are these, and only these are even possible. They have to be less than 27. And I know 9 goes in. So, and I know that 9 can come out because I can take a neat square root of that with no remainder, and I bring that 3 out. The square root property essentially just says that if you have x squared equals 9 or something similar, of course x could be 3. 3 squared is 9, but there's also a negative branch or negative option. Okay, so the statement is here: if a squared equals b, then you can take the square root of both sides as long as you add the plus or minus. Okay, so for example, if x squared is 100, we can introduce a square root, but we have to place the plus or minus. Let me show you why. Because 10 squared is 100, but it's also true that negative 10 squared is negative 10 times negative 10, which is also 100. So both of these must be included in our answer. So it's right here that we need to include the plus or minus. Okay, let's do 3 examples, and that will be it. So, ready to take the square root since x squared is isolated. So I'll take the square root and I'll add the plus or minus to cover those 2 solutions, 8 and negative 8. Isolate the x squared. I'm going to say that quite a few times today, because if we can isolate the x squared, we can take the square root and be done. As long as it goes in nicely and we don't have to simplify. But the square root of 16 is 4. So either 4 or negative 4 could make this equation true. Okay? Sometimes things go a little wrong and we get a negative over here. I guess things didn't go wrong. I mean, we didn't do anything wrong. But this is a scenario where there's actually no real solution. Let me explain why this is kind of like a dead end for us. Because no matter what, if you square a positive, you get a positive. If you square a negative, what do you get? Negative times negative, which is a positive. So if you're squaring and you're getting a negative, something's not right. It's not possible. Okay? Because when you square something, you always get a positive. Positive times positive, negative times negative. No matter what you do, they're always positive. So this is actually not possible. If you did take a square root, negative 1 is actually, the square root of negative 1 is actually called I, but that's an imaginary unit. So it's not going to be part of our answer here, but it certainly exists. It's imaginary. imaginary numbers were used to explore parts of math that didn't seem to have any sort of answer. It actually allows us to fully factor any polynomial if we include the imaginary unit. So that's kind of neat. We might see that later. Okay, so I divided by 10 because I want to start peeling away the things so I can solve for x squared. And then I'll subtract, and then I will introduce a square root with the plus or minus. Okay. And a few more. So this is still of the form a squared equals b, right? So I can still take the square root of this, believe it or not. As long as I put that plus or minus, the squared will dissolve away, and I'm going to get something like this. Okay, so normally we just are done here, but we got that plus 1 to handle. We got to solve for x. So what I think is easiest is if we consider the positive and the negative 7 separately, solve the equations, and then call it a day from here. So the plus or minus really means that there's two equations. There's a positive one and a negative one. Okay. And sometimes we aren't as lucky and we get a square root that is not a perfect square underneath. So we're going to have to do our strategy and search for a perfect square, which 4 definitely works. So that guy comes out like that. All right, I wanted to keep it brief, but that's the gist.